Barbara Westfield was the kind of woman who wore her power like her signature pearl necklace, tightly clasped and always on display. For 15 years, she had ruled over Riverdale Heights with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Most mornings, residents would spot her patrolling the neighborhood in her white Lexus SUV, slowing down whenever she noticed something out of place. Another day, another violation, her neighbor Tom whispered to his wife as they pretended to water their perfectly trimmed lawn. They watched Barbara park in front of the Rodriguez family's home, her red heels clicking against the pavement as she marched toward their newly installed basketball hoop. The Rodriguez family had moved in just 3 months ago, bringing life and laughter to a street that had grown too quiet under Barbara's watch. Their 12-year-old son Mateo practiced every evening, his basketball bouncing rhythmically until sunset. Barbara had complained about the noise at the last HOA meeting, but when no one backed her up, she had to find another angle. "Excuse me," Barbara called out as Mrs. Rodriguez opened the door. "I'm afraid this basketball hoop violates Section 4, Paragraph 7 of our community guidelines." She tapped her manicured fingernail against her clipboard. "Recreation equipment must be stored out of street view between uses." Mrs. Rodriguez sighed. This wasn't her first run-in with Barbara. "My son uses it every day. It's not exactly something we can move easily." "Rules are rules," Barbara replied with a tight smile. "I'll give you until Friday to relocate it to your backyard." She turned and walked away before Mrs. Rodriguez could argue, making a show of taking a photo of the violation for her records. What the residents of Riverdale Heights didn't know was that Barbara's interest in their basketball hoops, bird feeders, and mailbox colors was just a warm-up. Her real passion project was brewing behind closed doors in HOA meetings that somehow always seemed to be scheduled when working families couldn't attend. That evening, Barbara stood in her home office overlooking the river that curved around the eastern edge of their community. The sunset painted the water in shades of orange and pink, but Barbara wasn't admiring the view. She was imagining boats, dozens of them, docked at a sleek marina with her name on it. "It's perfect," she muttered to herself as she reviewed the architectural drawings spread across her desk. The plans showed a sprawling waterfront complex complete with a restaurant, boat slips, and a private beach. At the center of the blueprint, in elegant script, were the words Westfield Marina. Her husband Frank entered the room carrying 2 glasses of wine. "Still obsessing over your little project?" he asked, setting one glass beside her papers. "It's not little," Barbara snapped. "This will transform Riverdale Heights. Property values will soar. Everyone will thank me once it's finished." Frank knew better than to argue. After 20 years of marriage, he had learned to nod and sip his wine when Barbara got that determined look in her eyes. "There's just one problem," she continued, tapping a red X marked on the blueprint. "Sullivan's property. He owns 30 feet of prime riverfront that we need for proper access." "And he won't sell?" Frank asked, already knowing the answer. Barbara's mouth tightened. "He thinks because he was some big naval commander, he can stand in the way of progress. But I've been doing some research." She pulled out an old folder labeled Original Property Deeds, 1965. "These old easement rights give the community access to the riverfront. Sullivan's property is subject to them, whether he likes it or not." Frank frowned. "Are you sure that's what those documents mean? Maybe you should consult with another lawyer." Barbara waved her hand dismissively. "Our lawyer says it's a gray area, but gray is good enough for me." She took a sip of wine, her eyes gleaming with determination. "Next week, I'll call for a special vote. With the proxy signatures I've been collecting, I already have enough to move forward." As darkness fell over Riverdale Heights, lights flickered on in homes throughout the neighborhood. In their kitchens and living rooms, families went about their evening routines, unaware that Barbara Westfield was about to drag them all into a battle that would end with more than just violation notices and bitter arguments. At the far end of the street, in a modest house with a neatly kept garden, Commander James Sullivan sat on his porch watching the same river. Unlike Barbara, he saw not potential dollar signs but the natural beauty and peace he'd fought to protect during his long naval career. Little did he know that the battle lines were already being drawn, and his quiet retirement was about to be disturbed by the most determined opponent he had ever faced. The community center buzzed with nervous energy as neighbors filed in for the emergency meeting Barbara had called. Paper cups of watery coffee sat untouched on folding tables while residents whispered among themselves, wondering what new rules or fees would be announced tonight. "She's up to something big," Mrs. Chen murmured to her husband. "Look at that smile. It's like a cat that found the cream." Barbara stood at the front, tapping a pen against her clipboard until the room quieted. Behind her, a large white sheet covered something propped on an easel. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Barbara began, her voice dripping with rehearsed warmth. "Tonight, I'm thrilled to share a vision that will transform our little community into the crown jewel of the county." With a dramatic flourish, she pulled away the sheet to reveal a glossy poster board showing an artist's rendering of a waterfront complex. Gasps filled the room as residents took in the image of sleek buildings, a restaurant with outdoor seating, and rows of boat slips stretching into the river. "I present to you Westfield Marina," Barbara announced, emphasizing her own last name. "This premier development will increase all of our property values by at least 30%. For the next 20 minutes, Barbara detailed her plans, glossing over costs and focusing instead on phrases like luxury amenities and exclusive access. Most residents sat in stunned silence, but a few began to nod along, seduced by the promises of higher home values. In the back row, Commander Sullivan listened with his arms crossed. When Barbara finally paused for questions, his hand was the first to rise. "Yes, Commander Sullivan." Barbara acknowledged him with a tight smile. Sullivan stood, his tall frame commanding attention. "This looks like quite a project," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But I'm curious about something. That marina appears to cut across part of my property line." Barbara's smile didn't waver. "We've reviewed the original community plans from the 1960s. There's a 30-foot easement along the waterfront that was established for community use. Your property is subject to it." "I've owned that land for 27 years, Sullivan replied. "My deed shows no such easement." Barbara waved a dismissive hand. "Legal technicalities. Our HOA attorney has confirmed our right to develop that strip." From the middle of the room, Dan Thompson, who worked as a local contractor, spoke up. "What's the cost to homeowners? This looks expensive." Barbara's smile tightened further. "There will be a temporary special assessment, a small price to pay for such a significant improvement." She quickly moved on before anyone could ask for specific numbers. By the end of the meeting, Barbara called for a vote. "All in favor of proceeding with the Westfield Marina project, please raise your hands." About a third of the hands went up. "And I have proxy votes from absent homeowners," Barbara added, holding up a stack of papers, "which gives us a clear majority. The motion passes." As people filed out, Sullivan approached Barbara. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "That land has been in my care since I retired from the Navy. I won't let you bulldoze it for a vanity project." Barbara leaned closer. "Look, Commander, progress happens whether we like it or not. You might as well get on board." "I'll be contacting my lawyer tomorrow," Sullivan replied. Barbara laughed lightly. "Do what you need to do, but construction starts next month." The following weeks brought a flurry of certified letters to Sullivan's mailbox, each filled with legal jargon and veiled threats. He consulted 3 different attorneys, all of whom said the easement claim was questionable but would be expensive to fight. Sullivan wasn't wealthy. His Navy pension covered his modest needs, but a lengthy legal battle would drain his savings. Still, he wasn't giving up. What he didn't expect was how quickly Barbara would move. On a Tuesday morning in early spring, Sullivan had a doctor's appointment for his annual physical. He left home at 8:30, his property peaceful and undisturbed, the old oak trees he'd nurtured for decades standing tall along the riverbank. When he returned 3 hours later, the sound of heavy machinery hit him before his house even came into view. Rounding the corner onto his street, Sullivan's heart nearly stopped. Yellow bulldozers crawled across the Riverside strip of his property, their metal blades already cutting into the earth. One of his beloved oak trees lay on its side, its roots exposed to the sky like grasping fingers. At the edge of the property, Barbara stood watching the destruction, a hard hat perched perfectly on her highlighted hair, a smile of triumph on her face. Commander Sullivan stood at the edge of his property, watching helplessly as the bulldozers tore through soil he had carefully tended for decades. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from anger held tightly in check. 3 workers in hard hats glanced his way nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "You need to leave," Barbara called out, marching toward him with a clipboard tucked under her arm. "This is an active construction site." Sullivan didn't move. "This is my property." "Not anymore," Barbara replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We have permits." She waved a paper with an official-looking stamp. "You're trespassing on a community development project." A police car pulled up slowly. Officer Pete Wilson stepped out, looking deeply uncomfortable. Pete's father and Sullivan had served together years ago. "Commander," Pete said, nodding respectfully. "Mrs. Westfield called about a disturbance." "She's bulldozing my land, Pete," Sullivan said quietly. Barbara thrust her permits forward. "We have all the proper documentation." "The commander is interfering with approved construction." Pete reviewed the papers, frowning. "These seem to be in order, but," he lowered his voice, "Commander, maybe you should speak with a lawyer before things go any further." Sullivan nodded slowly. There would be no stopping this today. "I'll be making some calls," he said, looking directly at Barbara. Then he turned and walked back to his house, his back straight as a mast despite the weight of defeat pressing down on his shoulders. Inside, Sullivan made himself a cup of black coffee, the same way he'd drunk it for 30 years at sea. His kitchen window faced the river, a view now marred by yellow machinery. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in almost a year. "Admiral Thornton's office," a crisp voice answered. "This is Commander James Sullivan. I need to speak with the Admiral." 20 minutes later, Sullivan had explained the situation to his old friend. Admiral Thornton had listened quietly, only interrupting occasionally for clarification. "This doesn't sound right, Jim," the Admiral said finally. "Those permits should never have been approved without your consent if it's your deeded land." "Barbara's husband has a cousin in the county permit office," Sullivan explained. "I think strings were pulled." "Give me a few days," the Admiral promised. "I'll make some calls." Over the next week, Sullivan moved with the quiet precision that had made him an effective officer. He filed formal complaints with the county board. He gathered his property documents and took them to a new lawyer in the next town over, away from Barbara's sphere of influence. He photographed the destruction and the continuing construction. At the next HOA meeting, Sullivan arrived early, taking a seat in the front row. Barbara seemed surprised to see him, a confident smile faltering slightly. "Commander, I didn't expect you to join us tonight," she said. "Wouldn't miss it," Sullivan replied calmly. When the meeting began, Barbara spent 20 minutes showing glossy photos of the progress on what she now called Riverdale Heights' magnificent waterfront transformation. "And now," she finally said, glancing at her watch, "we have time for a few brief comments. Anyone?" Several hands shot up, but Barbara pointed to Mrs. Lee at the back. "Yes, but please keep it quick. We're running late." Mrs. Lee asked about the increased HOA fees that had appeared on their latest statements. Barbara explained it away as necessary infrastructure improvements and quickly moved to the next person, who asked about parking at the new marina. Sullivan kept his hand raised throughout, but Barbara carefully avoided calling on him. As the meeting was about to end, he simply stood up. "I believe I have the floor," he said in the commanding tone that had once directed hundreds of sailors. The room fell silent. "I wanted to inform everyone that I've filed a formal complaint with the county board regarding the permits for this project," Sullivan stated clearly. "I've also submitted documentation to the State Environmental Protection Office, as the current construction violates 3 statutes regarding riverbank preservation." Barbara's face flushed red. "That's absurd. Our permits are in order." "Permits obtained through family connections," Sullivan replied evenly. "My attorney will be contacting each homeowner about the potential liability if construction continues on disputed land." A murmur ran through the crowd. No one had been told about potential legal problems. "And one more thing," Sullivan added as he headed for the door. You might be interested to know that Admiral Thornton, the current commander of the Eastern Seaboard Naval Operations, will be visiting next week. He's very interested in seeing what's happening to a retired officer's property. He nodded politely. Have a good evening, everyone. As the door closed behind him, Sullivan allowed himself a small smile. The battle was just beginning, but for the first time since the bulldozers arrived, he felt the tide starting to turn. Of course, Sullivan agreed, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth as he sipped his evening bourbon. Across the street, Barbara's house blazed with lights as an emergency HOA board meeting stretched into its third hour. The video of Barbara Westfield, covered in mud and screaming about the Navy ruining her ceremony, became an overnight sensation. By Monday morning, it had appeared on 3 national morning shows, usually followed by anchors trying not to laugh as they transitioned to weather reports. For the residents of Riverdale Heights, the bombardment was just the beginning of changes that swept through their community like the tide rushing up the nearby river. Barbara emerged from her house Monday afternoon wearing oversized sunglasses and a scarf around her hair, despite the warm weather. She made a beeline for her white Lexus, ignoring Mrs. Rodriguez, who was walking her dog nearby. "Going somewhere, Barbara?" Mrs. Rodriguez called out cheerfully. Barbara pretended not to hear, but her tense shoulders told another story. She hadn't expected to open her door that morning to find 3 news vans parked on her street or a pile of violation notices, identical to the ones she frequently distributed, taped to her mailbox, citing her for excessive noise and creating a public nuisance. What she really hadn't expected was the team of county officials who arrived at the riverfront construction site with cease and desist orders in hand. All work is suspended pending full investigation, a gray-haired woman in a county parks department jacket announced to the construction crew. Environmental impact was not properly assessed, and permit applications contained significant discrepancies. By Tuesday, 3 different government agencies had representatives crawling over the half-finished marina. Men and women with clipboards and serious expressions took water samples, measured distances from the riverbank, and photographed everything. Sullivan watched the proceedings from his porch, sipping coffee from his Navy mug. When a young county official wandered over to ask some questions, Sullivan invited him in for a fresh cup. "Found anything interesting yet?" Sullivan asked as they sat at his kitchen table. The official glanced around nervously before lowering his voice. "Off the record?" The permits were rubber-stamped without proper review. Someone's cousin in the department pushed them through. But that's not even the biggest issue. "Oh?" Sullivan raised an eyebrow. "We found financial irregularities in the HOA accounts, the special assessments for the marina. A significant portion was allocated to something called Westfield Consulting, paid to a company registered in Barbara's maiden name." Sullivan nodded thoughtfully, unsurprised. Interesting timing for all this to come to light. The official smiled slightly. The Navy incident put a spotlight on everything. Nobody wanted to look too closely before. Now, everybody's paying attention. By Friday evening, a special community meeting had been called at the local elementary school gym, neutral territory away from the usual HOA meeting room in Barbara's preferred venue. The turnout was extraordinary. Every homeowner in Riverdale Heights seemed to be present, sitting in uncomfortable plastic chairs beneath basketball hoops. Barbara and her husband were noticeably absent. Tom Reynolds, who worked as an accountant, stood before the crowd with a stack of papers. After reviewing the HOA financial records, which we finally obtained through a resident's legal action, he nodded towards Sullivan. "We found that over 30% of our dues for the past 3 years have gone to suspicious consultancy fees and undocumented expenses." A murmur of anger rippled through the room. "Furthermore," Tom continued, "we've discovered that multiple HOA votes were improperly recorded. The marina project never actually received majority approval." The murmur became a roar of outrage. Mrs. Chen stood up from her seat. "I move that we hold an emergency election for a new HOA board." The motion passed unanimously. By Sunday, Riverdale Heights had a completely new HOA board, headed by retired municipal judge Mr. Patel, who promised transparency and proper procedure in all matters. Their first official act was to restore Sullivan's property lines and halt the marina project permanently. 2 weeks later, a moving truck appeared outside Barbara's house. She and Frank loaded their belongings without saying goodbye to anyone. A for sale sign appeared on their lawn the same day. Arizona, Mrs. Lee reported after calling the realtor friend who listed their house. They're moving to a retirement community near Scottsdale. No HOA, apparently. Summer turned to fall, and the construction scars along the riverbank slowly healed as grass and wildflowers reclaimed the disturbed earth. Under the new HOA leadership, a more modest community project took shape, a simple public park with fishing access and benches where people could enjoy the river. Sullivan donated a portion of his Riverside property for the park, with one condition, that a certain bench be placed at just the right spot to view both the river and the sunset. A small bronze plaque was attached to it, reading simply, "Sometimes justice comes from unexpected quarters." On clear evenings, Sullivan often sat on that bench, watching boats pass by. Occasionally, when Navy vessels traveled upriver, residents swore they could see signal lamps flashing briefly in Sullivan's direction, and if someone asked Sullivan about it, he would just smile and say that old sailors never forget their friends, or how to send a message when it really matters. 2 weeks after the HOA meeting, every mailbox in Riverdale Heights received an envelope with the HOA logo. Inside was a notice that made most homeowners gasp or curse, or both. Monthly dues were doubling, effective immediately, with an additional special assessment of $1,500 due within 30 days. "This is robbery," Tom Reynolds shouted, waving the paper at his wife across their kitchen table. $1,500, just like that? For a marina most of us won't even use. Similar conversations echoed throughout the neighborhood that evening. By morning, an impromptu gathering had formed at the local coffee shop. 15 neighbors crowded around pushed-together tables, their faces worried. "We can't afford this," Mrs. Chen said quietly. "Our daughter starts college next fall. Every penny is accounted for." "Can she even do this legally?" asked Dave from down the street, who worked nights as a hospital security guard. The bell above the door jingled, and the group fell silent as Barbara walked in. She noticed them immediately but simply smiled, ordered her usual skinny latte, and left without acknowledging their presence. Once the door closed behind her, Mrs. Rodriguez leaned forward. "She knows we're talking about her. She doesn't care." "Commander Sullivan said he was fighting this," someone pointed out. "Has anyone heard how that's going?" Nobody had, but they didn't have to wait long for an answer. That afternoon, a series of unexpected visitors arrived at Sullivan's home. 2 county officials in suits, followed an hour later by a stern-looking woman carrying a leather briefcase with the state environmental protection emblem. Barbara watched from her living room window, her fingers drumming anxiously on the arm of her chair. The next morning, construction at the Riverside came to an abrupt halt. The workers packed up their equipment and left without explanation. By noon, a rumor had spread that the permits were under review. Barbara was nowhere to be seen. The temporary victory was short-lived. 3 days later, construction resumed with even more equipment than before. That same afternoon, Sullivan found a thick envelope taped to his front door. Inside was a notice citing him for 7 violations of HOA rules, including unapproved garden structures, excessive bird feeders, and non-compliant mailbox height. Sullivan chuckled as he read through the petty complaints. When his phone rang, he wasn't surprised to see Barbara's number on the caller ID. "Commander," she said when he answered, her voice staggeringly sweet. "I hope you received the violation notices. The board requires these issues to be addressed within 48 hours, or daily fines will begin accruing." "Interesting timing," Sullivan replied calmly. "Oh, and one more thing," Barbara continued as if she hadn't heard him. "We've installed security cameras overlooking the construction site, for safety purposes, of course. Some of them may happen to be directed toward your property. I hope that's not a problem." Sullivan stepped onto his porch after hanging up and spotted them immediately. 3 black cameras mounted on tall poles along the property line, all pointed directly at his house. This wasn't about security, it was intimidation. That evening, as Sullivan grilled a steak on his back porch, a familiar car pulled into his driveway. Admiral Thornton stepped out, followed by a younger man carrying a laptop bag. "Jim," the Admiral called out warmly. "Hope you don't mind us dropping by unannounced." Sullivan welcomed them inside, where the younger man introduced himself. Lieutenant Greg Patterson, sir, communications specialist with the U.S. Montgomery. The Admiral thought I might be helpful. Over dinner, Patterson explained that the Montgomery was currently docked downriver for systems testing. We're doing exercises for the next 3 weeks in this area, he said, spreading out a map on Sullivan's kitchen table, including some targeting system calibrations. Interesting, Sullivan said, noticing how the test zone extended to waters not far from Riverdale Heights. Very interesting, Admiral Thornton agreed with a meaningful look. Lieutenant Patterson here is also something of an expert with electronic surveillance. Those cameras your HOA president installed might benefit from his professional assessment. The next morning, residents of Riverdale Heights noticed Commander Sullivan and a young man walking the property line, inspecting the newly installed cameras. By afternoon, all 3 cameras had mysteriously stopped working. Barbara immediately sent out a maintenance crew, who replaced them with even more expensive models. These failed within hours too. The back and forth continued for days. New cameras would appear, only to malfunction in bizarre ways. Some would swing around to face the sky, others would shut down completely, and one particularly expensive model somehow ended up broadcasting only reruns of old fishing shows. Barbara was furious. At the next HOA meeting, she implemented even stricter rules targeting anyone who sided with Sullivan. But with each petty restriction, more neighbors began to question her leadership. A resistance was forming in Riverdale Heights, with Sullivan's quiet determination at its center. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for Barbara's big event. She had been planning this moment for weeks, the official groundbreaking ceremony for what she now grandly called Westfield Harbor Resort and Marina. Invitations had gone out to local officials, potential investors, and select homeowners who hadn't openly opposed her. Everything has to be perfect, Barbara told her husband as she adjusted her cream-colored designer suit in the mirror. A gold brooch shaped like an anchor gleamed on her lapel, a new purchase specifically for today's photo opportunities. By 9 o'clock, a white tent had been erected at the Riverside construction site. Waiters in crisp uniforms arranged champagne flutes on linen-covered tables. A giant poster board displayed the artist's rendering of the future marina, with Barbara Westfield presence emblazoned across the top in flowing script. "Did you see the cameras?" Frank asked his wife as they walked toward the tent. "Channel 5 is here, and I think that's someone from the county newspaper." Barbara's smile widened. This was exactly what she wanted: publicity, recognition, and permanent proof that she had transformed Riverdale Heights into something worthy of attention. Across the street, Commander Sullivan stood on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the commotion with a puzzled expression. He hadn't expected such an elaborate event for what was essentially still a disputed construction site. His lawyer had filed multiple appeals, and the environmental office had flagged several concerns, yet Barbara was proceeding as if victory was assured. Down at the docks 5 miles away, Lieutenant Patterson was having a strange morning aboard the U.S. Montgomery. The advanced littoral combat ship was running through its regular systems checks when an unusual alert appeared on his monitor. "Sir," Patterson called to his superior officer, "we're getting some odd readings from the targeting system calibration." Commander Reynolds frowned as he looked at the screen. "Run the diagnostic again." Patterson tapped at his keyboard, his forehead creasing with concern. "Same result, sir. Something's interfering with the navigation input during the targeting simulation." "Is it that new software patch?" Reynolds asked. "Possibly," Patterson replied, though he wasn't convinced. The Navy had recently updated several systems on the Montgomery, and integration issues weren't uncommon. "The test is showing a phantom target lock about 5 miles upriver." Reynolds shook his head. "Shut it down and restart. We can't run exercises with glitchy targeting." "Yes, sir," Patterson agreed, but as his fingers moved across the keyboard, an unexpected message flashed across the screen. The system was initiating a training exercise, autonomously. "Sir," Patterson's voice rose in alarm. "The system is overriding the shutdown command." Back at Riverdale Heights, the groundbreaking ceremony was reaching its climactic moment. 30 people had gathered under the tent, sipping champagne and nodding appreciatively as Barbara detailed her vision for the waterfront transformation. "And now," Barbara announced, picking up a gold-painted shovel that had been propped against a display, It's time to officially break ground on the future of Riverdale Heights. Cameras flashed as she posed, the shovel poised above the dirt. Her three most loyal HOA board members stood behind her, all wearing matching blue blazers with little gold anchor pins she had distributed as gifts. Sullivan watched from across the street, shaking his head at the spectacle. As he turned to go back inside, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Lieutenant Patterson. "Weird system malfunction. Check NEWS later." Before Sullivan could puzzle out what that meant, a high-pitched whistle cut through the morning air. It started faint but grew rapidly louder, like something falling from a great height. Barbara, poised with her shovel for another photo, looked up in confusion. The photographer followed her gaze, his camera still clicking. Then it happened. A small dark object streaked through the perfect blue sky, moving so fast most people only registered a blur. It hit the ground with remarkable precision, striking the exact spot where Barbara had just thrust her ceremonial shovel. The impact wasn't a massive explosion like in the movies. Instead, it created a spectacular fountain of mud and dirt that erupted upward, drenching Barbara and her three board members in seconds. The golden shovel flew into the air, spinning like a deranged propeller before landing with a splash in the river. For 3 full seconds, everyone stood frozen in shocked silence. Then chaos erupted. People screamed and ran. Champagne glasses toppled. The beautiful architect's model of the marina collapsed in on itself as the table supporting it buckled. And Barbara stood at the center of it all, her cream suit now brown, mud dripping from her perfectly highlighted hair, her mouth open in a perfect O of disbelief. The mud-splattered crowd stood frozen in shock for several heartbeats before exploding into panicked movement. People scrambled in all directions, champagne glasses crunching underfoot. Someone knocked over the display easel, sending the architect's model sailing into the mud like a paper boat on a brown sea. What just happened? Frank yelled, wiping mud from his eyes as he tried to reach his wife. Barbara remained rooted to the spot, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Her carefully planned moment of triumph had literally blown up in her face. Mud dripped from her hair onto her designer suit, each splatter representing another $1,000 ruined. "My shoes," she finally whispered, looking down at her cream-colored heels now buried in brown muck. These were Italian leather. From his porch across the street, Sullivan watched the chaos with genuine surprise. Whatever message Patterson had sent him, this couldn't possibly be what he meant. Could it? He set his coffee mug down and hurried toward the commotion, military instincts kicking in. "Everyone stay calm," he called out as he approached. "Is anyone hurt?" Most people had retreated to the edges of the tent, but no one appeared injured, just muddy and confused. Barbara's face transformed when she spotted Sullivan, mud-streaked features hardening into fury. "You!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger. "You did this somehow." Before Sullivan could respond, the distant sound of sirens cut through the air. Within minutes, police cars, an ambulance, and, to everyone's surprise, 2 black SUVs with government plates arrived at the scene. Officer Pete Wilson was first to approach, looking bewildered. "Commander," he nodded to Sullivan, then turned to Barbara. "Mrs. Westfield, someone reported an explosion." It was him. Barbara stabbed her finger towards Sullivan again. "He sabotaged our groundbreaking ceremony." "I was across the street on my porch," Sullivan said calmly. "Ask anyone." As they were speaking, 4 men in Navy uniforms emerged from one of the black SUVs, followed by 2 people in suits. Lieutenant Patterson was among them, avoiding eye contact with Sullivan. "What is this?" Barbara demanded, trying to wipe mud from her face with a ruined sleeve. "Why are there military personnel at my ceremony?" One of the suited individuals stepped forward, displaying an ID badge. "I'm Agent Wom with Naval Criminal Investigative Service. We're here about a training round that may have impacted this area." "A what?" Barbara's voice rose to a pitch that made nearby glasses vibrate. "A non-explosive practice round," the agent explained. "Approximately 10 minutes ago, the U.S. Montgomery, which is conducting exercises downriver, experienced a targeting system malfunction. A single practice round was discharged. Based on trajectory calculations, it appears to have landed here." He gestured to the muddy crater at Barbara's feet. The local news crew, who had initially fled but now returned with cameras rolling, crowded closer to catch every word. "So let me get this straight," Barbara said, her voice eerily controlled despite her appearance. "The United States Navy bombed my marina groundbreaking." "It was not intentional, ma'am," Agent Wong replied. "The round contained no explosive material. It's designed to mimic ballistics for training purposes with minimal impact." He paused, looking at the mud-covered scene. "Although in soft ground like this, it can create quite a splash." The word splash triggered something in Barbara. She let out a strangled sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. One of the cameras flashed, capturing her mud-covered indignation for posterity. The Navy personnel began cordoning off the area with yellow tape, while Barbara's remaining guests retreated to their cars, many already on phones sharing the incredible story with friends and family. From the back of the crowd, Mrs. Chen caught Sullivan's eye and gave him a tiny smile. "Quite a ceremony," she whispered as she passed. "Best one I've ever attended." By evening, the video had gone viral. Local news led with HOA Marina project meets unexpected naval opposition, showing footage of Barbara, mud-splattered and wild-eyed, gesturing frantically at Navy personnel. The ceremonial golden shovel was eventually found half-buried in river mud 20 feet downstream, its handle bent at an impossible angle. Sullivan sat on his porch that evening watching the Navy's cleanup crew work under bright portable lights. Admiral Thornton called to express his deepest regrets for the training malfunction. "Strangest thing," the Admiral said, his voice suspiciously neutral. "The investigation shows the targeting system somehow locked onto a reflective object, possibly that gold-painted shovel. Pure coincidence, of course."